Today on Performance Talks, we have Rick Viscomi, Senior DevRel Engineer with Google, and we're going to talk about Crux and real user metrics. Hey, Rick, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
Good to have you, man. So I thought we'd just kick it off, and you could tell us a little bit, what is Crux, and maybe a little bit of the history there.
Sure. So you can think of Crux, or the Chrome User Experience Report, as two things. It's a data set, and it's also a suite of products built on top of the data set. The data set itself is a collection of real user measurements from Chrome users, and they represent how users are actually experiencing the page. That is how fast it loaded for them, how interactive it was, and also some demographic information about them. For example, what type of device were they using? Was it desktop or phone? The country that they were connecting from, and also their connection speed, or in terms of effective connection type, like a 4G or 3G connection. So on the product side, there are many different Crux tools as well. So there's the BigQuery data set that includes all of the raw data that's aggregated at the origin level. This is really helpful if you want to dig into the performance data and you want to see raw histograms. But if you want more easy access to the data, we have tools like PageSpeed Insights, where you can see the field data at the top of the report. You could also use what we call the Crux dashboard. It's a data studio product where you can easily get some of the origin level data straight out of BigQuery in a more graphical, user-friendly way. And recently, we also launched the Crux API, which is a user interface for people to programmatically connect and leverage the Crux data in any of their applications.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that most people don't realize is that the Crux data is there, so you don't need to add something to your website. You don't need, and you've got it historically, right? So kind of, it has tremendous value if you're, say walking into a website, where you're not armed with any historical context, and you can kind of come to Google and pull data that Google is using and that we know is accurate, to at least get a baseline and start to figure out where something is, it's just incredibly powerful.
That's right.
And can you tell us a little bit, I think Crux is I think some of us in web performance certainly know Crux, but I don't know that it's kind of made it to a broader audience, but I mean, it's been around for quite some time.
Yeah. The data set was announced at Chrome Dev Summit in 2017. And this has been an idea being kicked around Google for a while, because Google for a very long time has cared about user experiences on the web. And one of the challenges of trying to move the needle at web scale is having a data set at that scale as well. And we needed a common source of truth that we could share with the community, because of the old adage, you can't improve what you don't measure. We needed that type of data set where people can look at it and see how the web is performing and how it's doing. Is it trending in the right direction or the wrong direction? And at the individual website level, sites, like you said, that might not have any RUM data at all now do have access to this data and these insights. So it's a really powerful data set, and the tools that we build on top of it enable us to try to at least measure and move the needle in the right direction for users.
And so how does Google use the Crux data, or data like the Crux data, kind of the real user data, to guide decisions? Like how is this data used internally?
So Google has product partnerships with many of the large websites, and they're pretty much like performance consultants. They want to help improve those sites' user experiences. So they'll use data sets like Crux. So you don't need to have access to first-party RUM. You could look at data sets like Crux and say, it looks like you have a layout stability problem, or you have a loading problem. And then you can use public tools like Web Page Test or Lighthouse to understand why those problems exist and start to actually implement improvements.
Nice. And there was an announcement recently where it was kind of Google was talking about Web Vitals, and we kind of a lot of this we're following on web.dev. So can you walk us through Web Vitals and kind of what is the thought process behind that?
Yeah. Some feedback that the web community has been saying in general has been, there are too many metrics. It's almost like alphabet soup. Whenever a new metric is introduced, it's just like another 3 letters that don't make sense to anyone. Google is trying not to contribute to that confusion by setting up a program called the Web Vitals, where at most every year, or at least every year, Google will be introducing a set of metrics that are known to at least represent a good user experience. It's not only about page load time anymore. Once the page loads, that's the start of the experience, because then the user is going to go on to actually interact with and use that website or that web application. And it needs to be fast throughout. If a user clicks a button, that button should respond quickly. If they're scrolling through the page, it shouldn't have this jankiness on it. So the Web Vitals or the core Web Vitals are supposed to be the metrics that matter most to users. And at the same time, the core Web Vitals is a commitment by Google to have a consistent developer experience, where if you're going to use PageSpeed Insights or the Chrome UX Report data set, you're going to get shown all the same metrics, and they're going to be set on the same thresholds. So if we tell you a metric is good or you're meeting the right bar, then all the other tools are going to say that as well.
Yeah, and this is probably my favorite feature of the Crux data set, is this concept of having performance benchmark kind of bands, right? So, a lot of times, especially when we're working with clients, they'll be like, oh, the page is fast. Like, it's fast enough, or it's fast for me. And, having that kind of touchstone to say, okay, well, this is what fast means for this metric. And taking that histogram, because, I think a lot of times we forget, is especially people who aren't in the web performance industry, that like the page doesn't run the same speed for everybody, obviously.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily even have performance characteristics on the same device on the same day. Like, there's just, the internet is dark and full of tears, and devices have lots of things going on, and these things have a distribution. And, when we kind of when Google kind of sets the bounds and says, anything faster than 2.5 seconds for this metric is fast, and anything more than 3 seconds is slow. You can take that histogram and give it back to a user in something that makes sense. So you can have an intelligent business level conversation where you can say, hey, last month, 12% of our users were fast, and this month, 22% of our users are fast. Or you can focus on the tail and bringing slow into average. I think that's just a really good way to look at it and thinking about performance benchmarks. And so one of the things with Web Vitals is kind of not just establishing the metrics, but establishing the benchmarks. I assume that these benchmarks will change over time as, pages don't load today like they loaded 20 years ago. I remember when www was, worldwide wait. And, if you had a 15-second load time, killing it. Those days are long gone. But there's one metric in Web Vitals that I think is just a little bit, it's kind of a change of mindset for performance engineers, which is the CLS metric. And could you just give us a quick overview of what that is and kind of why layout stability matters?
Yeah. CLS stands for Cumulative Layout Shift. And a layout shift is that type of experience where you're on a website, maybe you're reading a news article, and then that hero graphic of the news article pops in and shifts the content down, and then you have to find your place again. So in terms of the user experience, it's a source of frustration. So this type of layout instability is a new concept for web developers to try to quantify. So last year in 2019, the layout instability API was launched, and cumulative layout shift was the first metric created to try to quantify that experience. And it's just the sum of all of these layout shift scores that happen on a page. The layout shift score is the approximately, but not really, the percent of the viewport that changed if a shift happened. So the C in cumulative layout shift is just the sum of all those shift scores. So you can end up with something like 1.0 to kind of sort of mean the entire viewport has shifted in the duration of this user experience. And it's also the type of metric that grows as much as you use the page. So if you're scrolling down the page maybe new things are happening on the page, and then you get new shifts, and then your CLS goes up. So it's not a single point in time metric, but actually like the entire user experience as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, and I really like it when we have, and I've said this many, many times, which is that, web performance, although it's certainly an engineering discipline, unlike a lot of other engineering disciplines, web performance really ties closely to marketing. I mean, the KPIs that we deliver by delivering a faster experience, I mean, they're most often felt by marketing, right? They're felt in lifting rates, decreases in bounce rate, right? And kind of all of these things that are driving the marketing side of the house. So bringing something like CLS in, it's really nice because it's like, hey, listen, shifting half the page down probably doesn't make the user happy. And like, maybe you didn't even know that was going to happen because, you kind of allocated an advertising banner, or you added this widget. And, kind of like a lot of things where it's like, we're going to add this marketing telemetry, or we're going to add this promotional concept. These have performance impacts. And if we can't measure them, then we can't bring them back to, to partners in marketing and kind of help make intelligent business decisions, which, actually brings me to it. This one's one of my pet peeves, but inside the Crux data is the notifications data set. So so I was wondering if you could just tell us what that is, and then kind of why you collect it.
Sure. So you're referring to the experimental notification permissions acceptance rate data.
Right.
We collect the acceptance rates, deny rates, ignore, and dismiss.
Yeah.
Deny, dismiss. Yeah. So while this is not a performance metric, it is a user experience metric. We think that if websites are showing prompts to users that they tend to reject, that's not necessarily good user experience. You're asking the users a question, or you're trying to show users something that they don't want. So that's just one kind of experimental way we're trying to measure aspects of the user experience. Some sites do it better than others, and it's not necessarily true that if you get 90% acceptance that you're doing everything right. Maybe that just means you're pre-prompting users a lot, and everybody's clicking no on the pre-prompt, and that by the time they get to the actual browser prompt, only the ones who want it have still survived the prompts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and for us personally, one of the kind of the major features of our software is this concept of a serverless worker that is delivered. And so when you've got a push notification, which again really was not designed for this purpose originally, you're actually taking away an incredibly powerful part of the browser just to enable the push API. So unless you're kind of, actually using that worker for its full purpose, you're leaving a lot of performance opportunity on the floor. Because client-side we've got server-side optimization, which people know about, but client-side optimization, there's still just a tremendous opportunity there to keep things moving. So I use the notifications API every single day. Like I'll, go to customers and be like, "Do you guys really like this push API?" And they're like, "Man, it's great." It's like, really, because 99.3% of people deny it. And maybe we should take this powerful feature of the browser and give it back to the performance team to do some good. And so, yeah, kind of along that concept of, kind of working with marketing, talking about analytics, one of the things that we get asked a lot is like, hey, Google Analytics has a real user metrics client built into it. And, we often have to explain that data is sampled. And then that data is generally, kind of displayed in an average. So how would you kind of walk a customer through the difference between, because they very rarely match, right? That the average of, say, content loaded on a sampled Google Analytics page will match what you would see in really high fidelity Crux data, where actually you don't see an average, right? Because and kind of why do you guys not use an average and use a histogram? Just kind of walk the user through like these two different, often diametrically opposed metrics.
Yeah. I'd say that Google Analytics and Crux serve different purposes. So in the case of Crux, it's more about coverage of the breadth of websites, even though it has kind of shallow list of metrics available, maybe under
Yeah.
10. While Google Analytics has a depth of metrics, but only applies to one single website. So the use cases would be different, but I do agree that the metrics that Google Analytics does provide its users for performance is lacking in terms of what modern metrics people are looking at. For example, it doesn't include the Core Web Vitals today.
Right.
One thing that my team has done with Core Web Vitals DevRel is to provide a JavaScript library called Web Vitals.js, where you could measure the Web Vitals client side and then beacon it back to whatever your analytics provider is, for example, Google Analytics. And then you could get some of that data in the tool. To your point about sampling, as long as it's a random sample, I think it's okay. It's still going to be representative of real user experiences. But the fact that it looks at averages is concerning because many people, I'm sure, have heard of the Bill Gates walks into a bar thing. The average net worth after Bill Gates walks in is like millions or billions of dollars, but before it's, some normal living wage. So an average is not necessarily representative of everyone. It could really be influenced by a single data point or the outlier. So the Chrome UX support and many modern web performance focused tools look at percentiles. The median is usually a safe one to look at. That means half of the experiences will be less than, half the experiences will be greater than. Web Vitals actually uses the 75th percentile as opposed to the median. The higher the number you go, the more assurance you have that user experiences will be at that number. So if the 75th percentile benchmark for the largest contentful paint, LCP, is 2.5 seconds, you have the assurance that 75% of experiences are better than that, or at least that. Why not 90 or 100%? Well, then you start getting into these outliers, and it's much more influenced by experiences that are not necessarily representative of typical user experiences.
Right. And I think that's like a key thing is knowing when have you reached a point of the sample set where you're saying something meaningful, but not trying to climb Mount Everest, right? So getting 100% of user experiences under 2.5 seconds for, whatever DOM content loaded, that's just not possible. I mean, unless you only have 10 users and they're all on Fiverr and something like that. And even then I would say it's probably not possible. So finding the percentile that, says enough to say something meaningful, but doesn't lead you down this direction of an impossible task. And I think, when we look at things like the 95th percentile, I think it's good because it's always good to know where that tail is, and you want to try to pull that tail in if you can. But yeah, I mean, we use the median when we actually kind of look at, say, resource level timing to determine what we should pre-cache client side. We actually use the 75th percentile exactly for that reason, to kind of say, hey, let's just go a little bit further out because we actually do want to bring some of that tail knowledge in. And so, yeah, I think that's super helpful. And then, I mean, all of this is about making websites faster, right? Which it's still amazing to me today, where people, I think a lot of times, it's like, do you want a faster website? It's like, yes, of course, I want a faster website, because if you didn't, you would say I want a slower website. But like, does it really matter? And like, I walk around and preach from the Bible of web performance and like all the impacts that speed has. But like, Rick, does it really matter? Like, does it actually make a difference? Like, how does it actually impact the business?
So the short answer is yes. Of course, performance matters. Performance is a critical part of the user experience. It's a very tangible part. You can actually see people get mad when performance is bad. And if you're a business, you don't want mad people using your product. People who are angry or frustrated won't complete whatever conversions you want them to do. Websites are in the business of selling things or getting people to do things, clicking ads, checking out, or consuming content. And if you're putting up barriers, people aren't going to do that as often. Just generally, like, web performance is also a form of making sure that people all have equal experiences. There are people from all parts of the world who have different network infrastructure. You could actually be biasing certain parts of your user base by putting up these barriers of performance. So it loads fast on my laptop, might be okay for people just like you on MacBook Pros, on fast internet connection, but there are people who are maybe connected to a cell network on a very low-end phone. And we have to also keep those people in mind as well, because you mentioned it earlier, performance is a distribution, and those numbers in the tail are actually real people having poor experiences. So pulling in that tail is actually improving user experiences, making people happier, and the business wins as well. They get people converting more often, and if that turns into revenue, that's great for the business as well. So it's kind of a win-win-win for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, when I talk to CMOs a lot of time and chief revenue officers most of the time, what I'm saying is, hey, you've got kind of a sales funnel, right? Nobody arrives to your website for free. You have paid either with advertising dollars or with time and content, right? So no matter what, when that user came here, you paid for that. Making the site faster is one of the few things that actually cleans everything in the funnel. So we have a metric that is really, really hard to calculate, but it's pretty eye-opening, where you look at bail rates. So this is the percentage of users that literally bail on the page before it's even finished loading. And it's like, well, listen, that's a lost opportunity. That's kind of top of the funnel. That's like a salesperson not picking up the phone when it rings. And then, like I said, it kind of keeps going. It keeps going with conversion rate. It keeps going with user satisfaction. So, what I like to ask is, if you're running an e-commerce shop or you're running an online platform, of course, web performance is an engineering discipline, but I think a lot of ways to think about web performance is as a percentage of your overall marketing budget, right? So one of the things we always find funny is like, we'll have a customer that'll spend, $10 million a year on online advertising. And we're like, listen, you guys probably want to put $500,000 or $1 million into web performance. And they're like, why? It's like, well, your advertising cost is going to go down. Your bounce rate is going to go down. Your bail ratio is going to go down. Your web performance, it makes all of those metrics better. And even if those things don't change. So would you agree with that, or?
I'm struggling to think of a single reason why worse performance could possibly be good.
Right. Right. I mean, maybe if you want to lower bandwidth, right? You want to frustrate users to the point where they just don't come anymore.
They don't have a website in the first place.
They don't have a website in the first place. Yeah. So, I mean, as our parting gift here, like what advice would you have for folks that are in web performance, and, where should they focus, and what resources I think should they keep their eye on?
I would say don't underestimate the value of A/B testing and getting real data. So it's extremely valuable to be able to prove that an optimization is actually optimizing the site. And if you can link that in your experiment to whatever metrics are important for your business, conversion rates or whatever, it's so much easier to get buy-in from people to say, if I do this, that will happen, cause and effect. And right. You can really get that very easily with A/B testing. I say that easily, but one of the hardest parts about A/B testing is the framework itself of doing the testing and ensuring that it's randomized and controlled and everything. The other thing I would say is to leverage lab and field data to their strengths. But by that I mean, I look at lab data as telling us how fast users are experiencing the site. And I look at lab data to answer, how do we make it faster? Sometimes people will look at lab data and start making inferences about what should be field data, how fast it is. For example, I'll load it on my own laptop and I'll make inferences about how fast this website is. Well, that's how fast it is for me, not necessarily everyone, going back to performance being a distribution. So I would encourage people, if you're using a tool like Lighthouse and you see my LCP was 1.5 seconds, don't start patting yourself on the back yet. Keep in mind that other people are using that website and other people are having very different experiences. If the tool is saying your LCP was good, but you have all of these other things in the checklist that you need to improve, you should still be looking at that. Similarly, I mean, it works both ways. If Lighthouse is saying you're getting 100 on your performance audits, that doesn't mean the job is done. There might still be room for improvement. Your field data might not necessarily be great. So to look at both sides of the coin, of both lab and field.
Man, that is just such great advice, because all the time we're talking to, customers and engineers of customer sites, and I think part of this is history. I think there's kind of an entire generation of web developers who grew up without access to real user metrics and were kind of used to kind of these synthetic metrics or lab data gathering tools, like GT metrics and Lighthouse and web page test and things like that. And we're always like, hey, these are fantastic tools to help you find how to make something better. But they do not reflect the actual user experience, right? They can help guide you, but these are development tools. And, you call it field and lab data. We call it real user metrics, and well, the opposite of that is fake user metrics. So but really it's about real user data and development opportunity, and kind of two different tool sets for two different jobs. And I think that's critical. And I think a lot of times we make the mistake of looking at synthetic data and thinking like, oh yeah, I got 100 on my Lighthouse score, everybody's having a great experience. And then it's like, well, why is the bounce rate 73%? It's like, I don't know. So tying those things back together, I think is great. Well, Rick, man, really appreciate the time. And this was great.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, buddy.